Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Everybody, welcome to today's show. I have a recurrent guest on the show today, my good friend Sam Miller. He was rolling through Los Angeles, and we sat out on my deck in Santa Monica and had a wonderful chat regarding how to teach health and fitness information. We touched on a lot of stuff, actually, and we didn't really plan the podcast, but it's one of my favorites because it really got into this idea of how to teach what we teach. Now, I know a lot of you are professionals. I get an awful lot of professionals and very savvy health enthusiasts listen to this particular show, and we all know that a lot of us are teaching people constantly. We're teaching our friends, our family, and our clients about this stuff. So we didn't know what direction this was going to go in, but it really turned into a really interesting discussion about how we do what we do. You know, me and Sam both teach professionals. It's part of what we do. So we find ourselves at the front of, on the stage, in the front of the room, teaching doctors and chiropractors and nutritionists and health coaches. And we both have developed a reputation, which is very kind of people to say, of the idea that we can explain very complex topics in simplistic ways. And that some people have said, I wish I could learn to do that, and we talked about that today. We talked about the idea of how you come up with a hook and analogies and how we learn and how you do lateral thinking and all of these things. And so it was a really interesting podcast. I think you're going to love it. I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope you will also enjoy it. Before I let you get into the show, make sure you go and check out Sam. He's at Sam Miller Science on Instagram. He has the Sam Miller Science podcast. He actually posted this exact same episode on his podcast a few weeks back. Definitely go check out his show. He's a wealth of knowledge, and also his website, sammillerscience.com. All right, let's get into the show. Hope you love it. All right, everybody, I'm here with my boy, Sam Miller. You guys know Sam well. He's someone that you're going to hear more from, and someone I've been hanging out a lot with, teaching me a ton, and wanted to have him back on the show. We're out here on my deck in Santa Monica, and he just rolled through town, and we're going to get some workouts in today. Just wanted to talk shop and give you guys some insights into, mainly we're probably going to be talking about, kind of our process and how we teach and think about things. So welcome on the show again, brother. Welcome to sunny Los Angeles.
All right, thanks, Jade. Glad to be here. I'm glad to sit down with you again. I think last time we did it, we were actually across the country from each other. We always try to sync it up where Jade will either be in Asheville, which is a few hours from me, or if I have to come out to California, try to do this. But I always like the vibe of an in-person podcast, so I'm excited to chat. I think one thing we definitely have in common is, like, as we are learning and going through our own evolution and figuring things out for ourselves and then transitioning into teaching coaches, like you said, it really does place an emphasis on not just understanding the concepts, but how do you actually simplify them and break them down to teach other people?
Yeah, it's funny. I had someone tell me, they say, I typically get this, and then after I met you, someone else said this about you. And so what it was they say, Jade, you have a really nice way of simplifying everything. I love listening to your stuff. And then somebody, I think it was commented on social media or something, and said, oh my God, you're like Sam Miller. Like, he has the best way of explaining stuff. I love the way you guys explain stuff. And I was like, I love that dude for the same reasons. And so one of the things I think is interesting is you and I both coaches, right? It's kind of what we do. We train, other trainers. I do a lot of education for MDs and NDs. I know you do that as well. We both train nutritionists. chiropractors. We have a lot of professionals that come to us. And I thought it'd be interesting just to kind of ask you a little bit and also give people a little bit of insight into how I think about things. How do you, when you're putting all this stuff together, how do you think about this stuff? How do you simplify this stuff? How do you get better at teaching some of these concepts? Because let's face it, dude. I mean, what we do is some pretty technical things, and I think a lot of people get lost when they teach in the jargon, in the mechanisms, in the biochemistry. And you and I seem to be getting a lot of sort of feedback on the fact that we're able to make this simply. So I'm just interested in your approach, and then maybe I can go through some of my approach as well. How do you deal with that stuff when you learn something new and then you're going to teach it to someone else?
Yeah, well, one great thing about when you do learn and then you're teaching, I think it reinforces your learning. So the first thing is, well, how do I outline this in my own mind to cultivate my understanding? And then if I were to explain this to a client, not necessarily another coach, what end goal, what result, or what pain point are we addressing? So, when we talk about metabolism a lot, frequently that goal is either fat loss, or maybe the person is experiencing something with their health, internal health, that's unresolved, and they're looking for some type of solution on that front. So I'm trying to identify what is really the problem here, what obstacles or roadblocks are holding this person back, where are we reaching that crossroads, and then I try to sort of come back to the origins of really that scientific component, or for us, it might be physiology. But I think if you only start with the physiology, if you only start with the textbook and not the end result of what someone's actually experiencing or what they're trying to accomplish, it becomes very hard to explain. So one of my models that I use a lot is most people, if you on Instagram, on Facebook, or on the internet in general, when they're looking for help with nutrition or looking for help in a functional medicine perspective, it's usually because they have some sort of physical goal. And what Jade and I teach is that goal is essentially preceded by their physiology, their internal health, those internal workings. So by understanding that, then I need to sort of gather my information, my resources, and my tools and figure out, well, what can I do to be manipulating the physiology or to get that person to that physical goal? And that's sort of how I start unpacking those layers. I think you really have to start with the problem first. And what's interesting is it's not that different from marketing when we're in business. Is I think, you really have to understand, well, it's not just about the features of how many times I get to check in with my coach. It's, well, how is that element or item actually serving to address the pain point that the client or customer has? So I think they're similar in that way, and that's kind of how I try to view frameworks both in coaching and in business.
I love that thought, man, because part of I know we get a bad rap too, right, sometimes, because certainly I start with marketing too, because I kind of go, all right, this is marketing language, which I know for people like you and I, pure scientists, bothers them a little bit. But I also know that marketing language captures the attention of the person I'm trying to teach. And I'm also, in marketing, they teach that whole thing, ping the pain, paint the possibilities, right? So when we talk about marketing, we always go, let's ping their pain so that they know we get what they're going through, which is sort of what you're talking about. Sort of like, okay, we get your problem. You're feeling fatigued. You're waking up in the morning achy with achy joints. You look in the mirror, you don't recognize the person you see. We kind of get into that sort of emotional state of the problem of the person. And in the background, of course, we have a deep understanding of the biochemistry. Like maybe we're dealing with metabolic endotoxemia, or maybe we're dealing with insulin resistance, or maybe we're dealing with these other things. But what I've noticed about the way you and I sort of deal with this is we won't necessarily talk anymore about insulin resistance in a way for clients. We might talk about that when we're talking to coaches, but when we're talking to clients, insulin resistance becomes hunger and cravings, because we know that when you're insulin resistant, you're going to have hunger and cravings. And so they don't necessarily want to hear about, I have insulin resistance. We just go, look, your hunger and cravings are causing the problems. Like you and I both have models. I use something called SHMEC. You use something called SHRED, right?
Yeah,
Shreds. These are acronyms, frameworks we can teach people, and they come from just what you were talking about, where it's basically like, hey, here is the real issue for you. You don't need to know all this background biochemistry. And then people become interested in that versus confusing them. So I think that's part of the reason why you and I have had some success in both a lot of success in working with clients, but also being able to teach coaches and professionals how to come up with these models for themselves, right? Where it's sort of like, to me, if I'm going to sit here and talk to you about insulin resistance and you don't have any background in biochemistry,
Right.
you're going to get incredibly confused by that. But if I just say something like sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and craving, schmeck, insulin resistance, the concept of that, the sort of clinical manifestations of that are included in the way you sleep and whether you'll be hungry or not, and whether you have predictable or stable energy and what's going on with your cravings and your mood. Insulin resistance is wrapped up in that. Excess cortisol production is wrapped up in that. And so you and I, it seems like, are always thinking from those sort of perspectives. And I think other coaches and trainers would be well to start thinking in these ways.
Yeah, I think it's branching out. So as a naturopathic physician for you and as a nutritional professional, and then also, educating coaches and serving in a mentorship capacity, I think it's important to branch out beyond conditions and symptoms. And because if they were to go to a more more like Western medicine, and they hear, oh, well, your blood sugar's high. Oh, well, you need metformin for the, sticking with the glycemic dysregulation or insulin resistance issue. And I think rather than thinking of conditions or symptoms, if we come back to, and this is almost like a stoicism or mindset thing, which is, what does this client or coach actually control? They don't necessarily, right now, they're very focused on the end result of what they're experiencing, their reality in their experience. But what's actually shaping that reality it's basically the consequences of actions that may have been from decades prior, or what they're doing in their day-to-day life currently, or how they're living their lifestyle. Like you said, maybe it's sleep, maybe high stress levels leading to excess cortisol production. So there are practices, there are elements of their routine that are contributing to that actual, manifestation of disease or what they're experiencing chronically. And I think all too often, both coaches and a lot of other physicians who maybe don't teach in frameworks or models or providing tools, they only stay on this physical side of the experience, or they only stay on, well, this is what high blood sugar is, or this is what, is going on a physiological or biochemical level. When I think, when a client can understand, well, my behavior, this is how my living and my reality is actually shaping this. So it's a lot easier to say, what is your hunger like before this meal, or how does your energy feel throughout the day, and identifying these things, because they start to realize that by being self-aware, by identifying those things and taking very simple actions, the condition becomes less overwhelming. Yeah. So really the process of having the tools, having the system, having the framework is all just about, I think, giving people traction in their transformation, because otherwise they just feel overwhelmed. And sometimes that's where people end up kind of in circles and not making progress over the years.
Yeah, and I think for everyone who's kind of wanting to understand this, and we'll get into some tips and tricks and things like that, but here's one, I think, example, and you correct me if I'm wrong if you think this fits, but here's one example maybe of where this can go wrong and how to make it better. So those of you who understand intermittent fasting have heard about the concept of autophagy, let's say, right? And so what a lot of coaches will essentially do, or a lot of lay people will do, they'll read about autophagy and this idea that autophagy can be anti-inflammatory or anti-aging or something that you want. But in reality, most people have no way to anchor to autophagy. And so it just becomes this thing that is sort of this amorphous thing that I want, but not really understanding what it is. What you and I tend to do is we'll say, well, how can I explain autophagy in a metaphor or an analogy that people will never forget, that anchors them to autophagy? And so like one of the things that I will teach, and, I did a podcast on this as well, is I'll say, like, imagine, like we're in my apartment right now. So imagine if in this apartment you have all these people coming in constantly, and I'm throwing parties all the time, and furniture is getting broken, and dust is on the floor, and it's so busy in this apartment that I can't ever clean it up. And the TV gets broken. It's so busy. It's like a party. It's like Animal House in this place, and I just can't fix anything. What's going to happen to that apartment? It's going to begin to fall apart. And so what I need to do is get everyone out. I need to have a cleaning crew come in. I need to have a maintenance man come and fix things. This is what autophagy does. When you stop eating and when you do go through intermittent fasting, it's essentially asking everyone to leave the party, giving your body and your cells cells a chance to recover and repair and recycle. Now, all of a sudden, that analogy, people go, oh, I see now why maybe I want to stay off food and why eating burgers and pizza and all this stuff all the time might be gunking up my, my apartment. And what's interesting is pure scientists and PhDs don't like to think about this kind of language and these analogies. But in reality, when you're teaching someone across the table who has no background in this, they understand what a house party is. They don't understand what autophagy is. And you and I seem to always create models like that.
Right. I think teaching with analogy is very important, and people can relate to. So, autophagy is not necessarily a relatable thing, but when you create an apartment or a home or using, I know with several different scientific concepts, you'll use the example of driving in a car, being stuck in traffic, using the hypothalamus as like the 5-star general of the endocrine system. I think people can understand command and control. They can understand driving in a car. They can understand checks and balances. They can understand very basic things. And I think a byproduct of the education system, and this isn't necessarily the fault of coaches or medical professionals or PhDs or anything like that, as we have very close relationships with all of those types of people. But I think there's less emphasis on teaching in analogies because in academia, it's more of, publishing the research and speaking about the science. But I think the bridge to real life application comes through anecdote. It comes through teaching in analogies and using those examples. Without it, I think we often struggle. And so, a common analogy I use with fat loss is kind of each attempt at fat loss or each person's attempt at fat loss, might be slightly different. It's like climbing a mountain. The way you prepare to climb Mount Everest might be significantly different than Mount Rainier or Mount Kilimanjaro. You might have climate differences. They're important considerations. So what works for one person, which might be, a lower carb approach, might not work for someone, with a different lifestyle or activity level or things like that. So trying to use the analogies, I think maybe some people are afraid of sounding too simple or breaking it down, but I think it's a really great way to teach. I think it makes the teacher more approachable, and it also makes everything easier to understand. It keeps everything very simple. So
yeah, and so I'll give you mine as well. So I love that, right? And I oftentimes will take stuff from Sam because I'm just like, oh, that's good. I want to use that. Mine is running a marathon, right? At the beginning of the race, you shoot off the gun. Everyone starts at the same place, but then one person's going to run it fast. One person's going to walk, jog. One person's going to stop and get water. Another person won't. Some people will have gel packs. Some people will be listening to music. Some people won't. So that's how I explain the journey of fat loss. And I would say every coach needs to kind of have their way to explain that. Now, one of the things about working with clients that's really interesting is you have to build sort of, in my mind, frameworks into this. And you have to kind of, look at things that we're all familiar with, which is why Sam and I will oftentimes, I know popular ones that we both tend to use is like analogies to computers, because we all use computers every day, or analogies to driving your car. We all drive a car every day, or analogies related to being in the kitchen. We all, prep food and eat. And so when you think about the common human experience, as you're trying to develop your own sort of analogies, think about what humans do every day that they relate to. They sit on furniture every day. They live in apartments every day. They drive in cars every day. They work with computers every day. If you can think about how to take these things and make them relatable to certain concepts that you're teaching, you actually help people marry themselves and anchor themselves more to what you're trying to get them to change. But this brings up a big question, and I want to ask you about this, because then we get into concepts that cause peers in this space to get in an uproar, right? And I'll give you an example about this, and I want to get your take on this. So what happens is when we're teaching to the lay public, if I'm teaching to the lay public, I'm going to use certain terms and certain things that I'm trying to get their attention. Part of it's marketing, partly because I know marketing anchors people. Even if I'm not trying to sell them anything, I'm still marketing so I can get them to buy into the changes I want them to make. And so we'll use terms like maybe metabolic damage or metabolic resistance or metabolic adaptation or some of these things that are sort of pseudo-scientific terms that
adrenal
work.
Fatigue.
Adrenal fatigue, yeah, these terms that work in sort of the lay person's mind and work well, actually. But if you and I are talking and we're sitting around with a bunch of, clinicians and people like that, they get very upset about this. And this creates this problem for people because they're like, but my client knows and has heard about adrenal fatigue and can kind of understand what it is, even though technically, physiologically, there's really no such thing really, but it works in sort of a marketing sense and helping clients understand. So how do you manage that stuff? Does it bother you? What's your advice for people who are worried about, well, if I use some of these terms, I'm going to be seen by my peers as, whatever, not smart or, doing pseudoscience or anything like that. Me personally, I just don't care because I'm serving the client.
Right.
But I also wonder, I know this goes on, so I'm wondering what your feedback is on that and how you manage that yourself.
Yeah, I definitely think it depends on the context of the message and the information that follows. So you might have a title that implies something about adrenal fatigue or metabolic adaptation or something like that. I think if you explain the compensatory actions that are occurring in the body or why the body adapts and you provide some solid education that is based in actual science, I think you're okay. I think it's people who only lead with the clickbait and are not, there's no substance that follows, or they're misinforming people. Because I think while there are a lot of great people out there providing great information in the fitness industry and just health in general, I think there's a lot of misapplication of good information, and there's also just a lot of misinformation that is then applied in transformations as well. So I think as long as you're very clear about proper application and how things should be carried out, that using a catchy title or maybe using something in marketing is okay. I think it's, in this day and age, it's very hard to get people's attention just in kind of the Instagram instant gratification world. So I think part of it is just I can't teach someone unless I have their attention. So if you have another way to get someone's attention, that's fine. But also you have to remember your impact at the end of the day is the number of people you can reach and inform with the correct information. So if that involves sort of getting them into the fold with that, I think you could argue it either way. I think people might agree just based on their philosophy or their principles, but I think we're similar in that we want to teach people, we want to help people and spread that information. It's very, very hard to do that without capturing someone's attention, which sometimes requires polarity and controversial or having some points of difference in order to get to that place.
Yeah, I'll tell everyone a funny story and tell you this, but I don't know, it's several years back now. I mean, time seems to just go so fast. Probably 5-6 years ago, I'm sitting with a group of clinicians and individuals who are sort of like this clinical roundtable discussion at one of these conferences that I went to. And they're sitting there, and one of them said, Jade, how did you get so successful in your business? And I knew some of these people personally. And I was like, honestly, I'm not afraid to market. That was the answer that I gave them. I was like, to me, a lot of you are afraid to market. You're afraid to, put yourself out there because you're more talking to your peers. And I've always been one of these guys. It's like, I don't care about that. I know that I'm dealing with, the clients the end client that I'm trying to teach. And so one of the things that they said, well, how do we bridge this gap then? And I remember saying, well, you know what a hook is, right? And they're like, well, just walk us through how you look at it. And I'm like, well, you can take a concept like adrenal fatigue and you can just provide a good hook. And I'll teach everyone this right now. The hook is everything. It's the thing that, will sell your book. It's the thing that will get people to keep watching your video. It's the thing that when you're sitting across from someone teaching them about biochemistry that will make them listen and not tune you out. The hook is everything. And the hook is a very simple concept. It just goes like this. It goes, you think it's X. It's really Y. That's a very simple hook, and that should be the lead-in to everything you do. Now, watch what happens with this. You think X, it's really Y. As soon as you do that to the human brain, people anchor, and now they're listening. They're like, ooh, I'm sort of wrong about a thing. So now you could take things that we're talking about, Sam, like adrenal fatigue that have confusions around them and are controversial, or metabolic damage, and you just make it a hook. You go, you think it's metabolic damage. It's really more like metabolic dysfunction. Or you think that metabolic damage means that your metabolism is damaged and never will be repaired again. It's really just what the metabolism does naturally. So can you see by taking these things and instead of avoiding them, you can create hooks out of them and immediately get everyone paying attention. And I think this is something that you and I have just naturally gravitated towards doing. If I see someone using a particular term, I grab that term because I know it's interesting for people. And then I turn it into a hook and do exactly what you said to do, which is like, I'm going to throw it into a hook and then I'm going to give them the really good information about it. Now, if you're someone that really is not up on your biochemistry like Sam and I or whatever, then learn that stuff. That's part of what you and I do. We teach other people to teach this stuff, but you won't get yourself in trouble if you know what you're talking about and you just turn the hook around. And matter of fact, not only will you not get yourself in trouble, but everyone, including peers, will want to listen to what you have to say, because every human brain, no matter how smart someone is, loves a good hook. If I say to Sam, you think it's about adrenal fatigue, it's really about brain fatigue, right? Then Sam's going to go, he knows what I'm talking about, but he'll be like, damn, Jay, that's good, right? Like, that's good, and that's what we want to kind of do. So I'm wondering.
Or you think it's brain fog, but it's really X, Y, Z.
Exactly,
so
right?
I think what's nice about that type of title, though, is it instantly clarifies, hey, I'm using this term in here, but it's really not this,
Yep.
So it brings it back to, I think it just brings it back. It addresses the symptom or the pain point or what someone is experiencing, but then also allows you to reel it back in to where you maybe are able to provide more education. So I really like that, which kind of provides a little bit of a natural segue into some of the marketing. But I think also, when we're talking about tools and frameworks, I think in addition to just the biochemistry and metabolism and hormones and endocrinology, I think we've both kind of come to the conclusion over the last decade, or maybe more. Jade's got a little bit of a heads up on me. Still my little brother. But
I love when you guys call me the OG of metabolism. I'm like, I'm that damn old now.
Nah. Well, I got an early start, so even though we're not too far, but so I think one thing we both realized is it's not just the science of. And we were actually talking about this the other day with my Instagram handle and the podcast and Sam Miller Science and this, that. It's not meant to be only physiology. It's kind of like everything about life has a science to it. And that's where tools and frameworks are required. And so I think this lends itself to, okay, what about tools and frameworks from a personal development standpoint? And why is personal development so important in a journey to repair physiology or internal health? Because I know we both believe that if you don't have the proper mindset towards your transformation or proper routines in place, proper habits, and really a solid level of self-awareness, it becomes very hard. I feel like your physical goals or achievements that you're accomplishing are very fleeting because you don't actually have the foundation, the cornerstone or linchpin, which oftentimes is personal development. And I know you've been doing a lot of teaching on that as well.
Yeah. I mean, it really comes down, people have heard, and, I forget, who was it, Cynic that wrote, Find Your Why or whatever. I think it was him.
Right.
But, people get this concept. You do things for a reason. For example, why is it so easy? Let's all be honest. Why is it pretty easy in our 20s to get in shape? Vanity is our why. We want to look good, right? That's a strong sort of why. And then what happens is as we age, vanity becomes less of a concern, and we have to begin to tie this why to something else. What's really interesting is we know from research that, health concerns that are down the road, the brain doesn't really grasp that. So if they're just like, you keep smoking, you're not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to live a long, healthy life. A lot of people that doesn't resonate with. It's not until, they start seeing that other people find smoking disgusting and think that their clothes smells and find them rude if they're smoking in public, that is the real thing that starts to get people to change. That actually has more impact on people stopping smoking, these public campaigns about, making you a public pariah if you do smoke, than actually the fact that you're going to get lung cancer. And so to me, this is very few people respond to fear tactics. What they respond to is they respond to the why am I doing this? Why does this make a difference? Is it vanity? Is it for purpose? Is it so I can live, for my grandkids or whatever it is? That is the reason why self-development is so important. Most of what we are doing with health and fitness, the reason why we want to look good, feel good, live longer, function better, goes back to the key needs of the human brain. We want status and autonomy and certainty and relatedness and fairness and these things that we know the human brain is geared to latch onto. And so if we as coaches aren't aware of this research and this psychology, we might be able to give good information that it's almost just like water off the back of a duck. We're like, here's some great information. And then people are like, so? Like, in the end, I don't care about that. So to me, that's why it's so important. And again, it's the hook, right? Or it's relatability. If I say something universal about pain, I know that every single person listening to this podcast right now, me and Sam know, you've had pain as a human. It's a universal. You've probably had heartbreak. Many of you have had lost, loved ones. Many of you have had these deep-seated, triggering, lightning strike moments in your life that really make you stand up and pay attention and make you who you are. So if I can tap into those deep needs of you as a human, then give you good quality information about how to change your health, for example, I can make a difference whereas I couldn't otherwise. So personal development becomes everything. And I'm interested to hear your sort of take on why you think it's so important. But for me, I kind of, after you see thousands and thousands and thousands of clients and see how often they fail, like one of the things I often say to people is I say, if you want to be humbled every single day, go into the weight loss business. I mean, you will fail most of the time. And part of the reason you're failing most of the time is because you have failed to connect to people's brains. And instead, you're trying to the real human needs of the emotional needs of the human brain, and instead just trying to feed them information. So to me, that's why it matters. And that's why a lot of us, like me and you, spend an awful lot of time understanding that stuff. Because if you don't, you're going to fail most of the time. Now, you can be ignorant and arrogant about it and just be like, well, that's their fault. That's the other person's responsibility. But I would say a good coach knows that stuff. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I have some, real life example to attach to that too. You mentioned the smoking or, I have a friend in North Carolina. It's still common that there are a lot of guys who still chew and stuff. And I actually have a friend, who I know through the fitness industry, who actually recently just finally quit, not because of the long-term health consequences, but because he is expecting a child and realized, okay, this is now his why. He then attached value to wanting to overcome this form of, I guess you could call it addiction, or this habit, and to drop it because, of this new factor in his life, which was then enough because obviously for a very long time didn't really, it didn't register in terms of what was going on with internal health or in terms of oral cancer or anything like that. And so it's very interesting that as soon as you said that, I could attach a single person that maybe experiences that. As far as the personal development, I think the further that I got into metabolism and endocrinology, hormones, physiology, anything really dealing with that. I mean, even the concepts we listed earlier, whether it was adrenals, whether it was insulin, if we take, men, for example, and testosterone considerations, it all ties back to stress. Well, then I'm thinking, okay, well, what types of stressors do we have in our life? And a large percentage of those deal with our perception of our day-to-day life, our experience of our day-to-day life, and our reality, as well as the foods we eat, the choices we make, and the amount that we move. So if I have almost, two different columns, and if you guys follow me on Instagram, I've actually posted kind of a diagram that's more circular of all the different facets of stress kind of bearing down on a human. But you start to realize there's an entire field on this, which is psychoneuroendocrinology, how important psychology and mindset are in integrating with, making a change to whether it's your hormonal profile or whether it's your body composition or anything like that. So I think as I was going through the process of coaching people in, nutrition or training, fitness, getting them to adhere to a plan, you realize, well, if it doesn't fit with their life, if they don't attach value to what I'm trying to get them to do, there's no stickiness to it, right? And so to get it to stick in their life, you really have to have that integration and have it mesh. But I also think that such a large component of really everything from both a physical development perspective and in our own lives is just the perceptions of what we're going through, the pain that you talked about. And that's sort of when I began having that realization that, hey, this is really more than just fitness. This is really this crossroads or intersection of all of these different areas of life. And you can't really separate them, or at least not to have long-term permanent results with something. I think if you separate them, Maybe you follow a good routine in the gym for a while, or maybe you find something nutritionally that might work. But, as soon as your lifestyle changes, if you don't have that full integration of all those different areas, and I think, you talk about, you have both the P's that you use, and then with metabolism and teaching that, you have the multiple M's of metabolism with movement and mindset and all of those different things. It's really hard to separate the two. I know we both talk about community and relationships, and, it plays a huge role. I mean, food in general is just such a big part of our community, our social interaction. People want to go grab drinks or something like that. So if those elements don't fit, then all of a sudden people, I think that's where you get blame or self-deprecation, or people losing self-esteem, because every time they break that promise to themselves and they can't adhere to the lifestyle that's in place for whatever reason in terms of what's going on, or their mindset changes about something, that sort of tears away or digs away at things like integrity and self-efficacy and your belief to actually accomplish your long-term goals. And that's where I think people end up in trouble.
Yeah, I think that's so incredibly well said, and I won't add to that, but I'll actually tie it back to what we were talking about before. So, because I think it's just a great segue to bring this all full circle. So, for example, if you follow what Sam is saying about all these things that go on in the brain and psychologically, the old model of metabolism really isn't able to account for that. The sort of metabolism as calculator or metabolism as chemistry set doesn't really take that into account. But if you start to perceive and use the analogy of and teach people the analogy of metabolism as stress barometer, you start to sort of understand, okay, well, if the metabolism is a stress barometer, then obviously the way I perceive stress and the way I handle stress becomes a huge component of things. And all those things you just talked about. So the reason this drives it home is because if I'm coaching you and I am teaching you macros and calculator type stuff and helping you understand, and you only see the metabolism as a calculator, you will absolutely miss 1,000% everything Sam just said about that can make a difference in the way you behave in the kitchen or in the gym. And so once I started just teaching the fact that no, the metabolism is actually a stress barometer, it's a better way to perceive it. Once I create that analogy, once I create that framework for a client sitting across from me, now I can immediately start the conversation that Sam just had and said, by the way, if your metabolism is a stress barometer, and you also understand that stress is something that we actually perceive. Some people can be under one form of stress and see it as the end of the world. Some other people can be under that same exact form of stress and see it as growth promoting, which is kind of why psychology research actually shows one of the major determinants of success is your ability to see failures and fears and setbacks as growth promoters versus something to blame and complain about. And now all of a sudden you've just expanded your arena of areas to intervene in. So it's no longer just about diet and exercise. Yes, too much or too little food or too much or too little exercise can both be stresses, but then we can expand it and be like, oh yeah, then the quality of the air and the water and endocrine disruptors, and most importantly, the stress we are impacted by socially, and our ability to see that as growth enhancing or growth degrading impacts us in huge ways. And so it kind of goes right back into this whole thing that's why you have to teach. In my mind, you have to learn to teach in a way that gives a more truthful way to intervene fully in the metabolism.
Right. And we use the term thermostat a lot too. In addition to stress barometer, you have to factor in, right? So with Jade's apartment example earlier, what's going on in the external environment, we'll sort of, while there is a calculator component to it, there's also a lot of facets that are determining, what's going on and what that internal temperature change will be. So if you have, we use whether it's a car or house example, if you have the temperature set to 68 and your environment, it becomes hot outside and you have the air conditioning on, the HVAC system will take that into account and then kick on the cold air. The metabolism is similar. It's going to factor in, the level of nutritional stress. So whether that's a calorie deficit, or I also view caloric excess as a stressor. So for some people, that might be the case. So nutrition could be a stressor. Training, too much training, too little training, too little movement, too much movement, too little sleep, are all examples of those stressors that are going to be factored in Jade's stress barometer example. So I really like that. I use the example of drains and charges because most clients understand, well, I know how to charge my iPhone, so they don't care what the parasympathetic or sympathetic state is, but I need them to understand that recovery is a key component of transformations, and that restoration and bringing yourself back to a place of wholeness and controlling things like your heart rate and getting recovered from your training and your movement will allow you to achieve better results long-term in your transformation. So, and what's a drain for someone may not be a drain for someone else. It might actually be a charge for someone else. So if I'm type 2 diabetic and I'm eating too many calories and I'm not moving enough, a charge for me might be a caloric deficit and moving. Whereas for someone who's maybe overtrained, doing CrossFit 14 to 21 times a week, not eating enough calories, for them, additional movement or further caloric deficit would actually drain them further because they're so different. Physiologically, they have very different cases of what they're experiencing. But if I were to reverse diet that person or in your case, kind of give them more food, you have the quadrants of EMEM, ELEL, or eat more, exercise less. So in that case, of that person potentially eating more food and potentially getting more time for recovery, they might actually be better off from a physiological standpoint. So whether it's stress barometer, drains and charges, understanding these different things, I think there's so many different things you have to account for. And if you're only doing that linear calorie model of calories in, calories out, well, what happens if, socially something happens or you're depressed and then your NEAT then decreases, right? So non-exercise activity level, maybe you're staying in more because you're not feeling great about yourself. And now all of a sudden that's changed our linear caloric equation, but it's really a result of all of these other areas of our life. And if as a coach or health professional, you don't have a pulse on those things, I think it's really hard to have this, fully integrated approach or for your clients to achieve long-term transformation.
Yeah, and if you're listening to that discussion with Sam, right, you see that there's a huge level of sophistication about metabolism in that whole discussion. Yet you didn't hear him use one time any of these big terms that people throw around, right? There was no, autophagy is not mentioned in there. Insulin resistance not mentioned there. He doesn't have to say GIP and GLP and PYY or any of these things. But yet there's this huge sophistication. And part of the way I think that happens is sometimes when you come up with these frameworks, you essentially say how many elements fit. And you start to try to put things on there, and then you see the frameworks sort of fall apart. So you sort of use another one. And I think where we are, these will evolve. But I think if you're a coach and you're listening to this, it's really about coming up with those frameworks. Of course you can. I talk about this with Sam all the time, and I think he feels the same with us. Some people are like, well, I don't want to take Sam's thing. I don't want to take Jade's thing. But the fact of the matter is that until you have your own, it's far better to do that. And that's part of why you and I educate. Of course, you come and take a course with you and I. It's like we want you to take our stuff. And then what we want to do is we want to see you improve upon it, because then one of the things that I've seen with Sam is I've seen him take some of my concepts. Some of his concepts are brand new and I'm taking them from him. I've seen him take some of mine and improve upon them, and then I'm like, oh cool, I get an extra brain, and then I can take that back and then I can improve upon it. Then he sees it and goes, oh cool, Jade kind of added this component, and so we kind of go back and forth like that. So there's a learning aspect to this, but I think first it's the level of sophistication you do sort of need to know this thing. And I will say one more thing, because it's going back to sort of the idea of personal development in psychology. One of the things that happens is if you only have, I just want to really drive this point home, but if you only have a model of metabolism as calculator, metabolism as chemistry set, you don't realize it's metabolism as stress barometer, you're never going to, for example, talk to your client about maybe their relationship with their mom, that every time they drop the kids off at mom's house and mom is doing X, Y, Z, and this is why they go home and binge on, whatever, and are not being able to sleep or any of this kind of stuff, you're not going to make an impact. And then you as a coach are that client's going to eventually leave you, which to me is like, once I started, it's like this. Once I understood science, and I want to see what you think about this, and really got clear and understood a lot of these mechanisms, I did see my results with people change slightly. But once I started understanding about intervening in people's lifestyles and around, sort of the mindsets and behaviors and the way we socialize with other people, that's when my results went sky high. That's when I started becoming known for someone that got results. It's when I started to integrate that stuff. And so what I would say is, there's a big discussion in our field now about evidence-based medicine and this, and this. And what I kind of laugh at this all the time, because I'm just like, if you really look at what evidence-based medicine is, yes, it's research-oriented. But if you're just doing the science, man, I'm sorry. You are not going to be nearly as successful if you're not integrating people's individual psychology and their personal preferences around what they're doing. I don't care how much you know about metabolism. I know a lot of people who know a whole lot more about this stuff than me, and I tend to get better results and sell way more programs because I'm integrating these frameworks and these analogies and these metaphors, and I also understand that it's about lifestyle, socializing, recovering, all of these kinds of things. So I'm wondering sort of what your take on that is, because we do have this sort of battle going on where it's sort of like, it should all be just research-based stuff and only science. And I'm just curious what your thought is on that, because I personally, I never saw that be something that really elevated my results as much as the stuff that we're talking about right now.
Right. It's kind of that example of, with clients, sometimes your emotional sensitivity is going to matter more than understanding leptin sensitivity, things like that.
Absolutely. It's a great line.
So I definitely agree with a lot of that. And I also think studies are meant to inform us and provide us with sort of, it's like if you were learning to bowl and you have the bumpers that keep you from rolling your ball into the gutter. I think it keeps us on a playing field of what's intelligent and what's safe. And then within that playing field, certain clients are, they might be on the left side of the pin or, the right side of the pins. They have different, they're each kind of unique in their own way and where they're positioned and things like that. So if our job is to draw from those generalizations and also realize that the specific population studied in the research may not be reflective of that specific client, but we can take tools or observations or anecdote or information from those researchers and say, how does this best apply to Sally, or how does this best apply to Janet or Tom? It is really where I think the science comes in and where research is important. I think it sort of keeps you in check in a way to make sure that you are practicing appropriately. But I will say that a lot of times, right, like how many studies are there on resistance-trained females in a specific age population who also know how to track their food and this, that, and the other thing? And then conversely, it's like, well, there might be a lot of studies on sedentary people or untrained populations or things like that. So I think evidence is good, science is good, research is very, very important, and I think we need to continue to invest in quality research and get information. But research without anecdote or personal understanding or connection, I think you're not going to be as successful. I think you have to be able to take that off of paper per se and bring it to life, and also help clients have that perspective too. I don't think you can just throw correlations at people and expect them to change.
Yeah. Two things I'll say on that, right? I mean, I think to sum that up, it's sort of like I always use this term. It's basically like research is a tool for averages. It's not a tool for individuals. Now, averages, the research, I read research constantly. I know Sam does too, because we definitely want to know those averages. It makes a difference. Most people will fall into that, but it's not individuals. And so oftentimes a lot of people will fall out of that. So you use it as a guide. We also don't want to just make shit up, right? We don't want, and that happens a lot as you talk about in this field. So I oftentimes, the way I do this is I use research to refine my approach rather than define my approach. In other words, I use my general knowledge base of physiology to define my approach, and my general sort of understanding of psychology to, sort of define my approach. But then I am open to the fact that if I see a study say this or that I've been doing this kind of wrong, research is going to refine it. I'll have an idea of my clinical experience, but I have to understand my clinical experience is a small drop of water in the bucket of individuals out there. So I always use science to refine my approach. And the final thing I'd say about evidence-based medicine, because I know this, and evidence-based nutrition and evidence-based sort of practice in general, is what we have to understand is there's a very specific definition for evidence-based. And basically what it is the current research consensus, all the research out there, along with the sort of background and experience of the clinician who's actually doing the work, along with the way that intersects with that person's individual physiology and psychology and personal preferences. That's actually what the definition of evidence-based practice is. That yes, it's the research, yes, it's sort of the art of the clinician and the intuition and expertise of the clinician, and then you have to take into account that individual. So if you're one of these people out there, I'm doing evidence-based medicine, all you're doing is reading research, and you're forgetting these other two things, you're sort of missing it for sure. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that brings up for you.
Definitely. I think the way that Jade just defined evidence-based is unique in that a lot of people on the internet put science-based coaching or evidence-based coaching in their profile or in their marketing materials, and they don't fully understand that it incorporates all of that. And I did have a couple points about research, but they kind of slipped my mind there for a second. But I think it is important to draw, like you said, to refine your approach and not necessarily define your approach. And that, I think there are some limitations in terms of research overall, in terms of applicability. And I really wish I remembered my point on that. I was so into what you were saying that I just got so focused on it.
I do that all the time, and I'll be like, I got 3 points. Point 1 is this, point 2 is this, and
I really only have 2.5. Yeah, it's like I forgot it.
It's like, and the older I get, I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Well, let's do this, man. We're kind of coming up on the hour, so why don't I'll let you go first. What would be some, sort of take homes that you would say, all right, I love discussions by the way, because, you and I didn't know where this is going to go. We just like getting together and talk about it. But if you were going to say, what are some take homes for someone who's really trying to, get good at this? If they're like, Jade, Sam, you guys are two experts in this field, in metabolism. I would like to learn how to think like you, and just any summation points that you have to kind of wrap up. Like, how do people begin to think like, we have been able to do? Where should they start? What kind of education? I mean, I know you have some courses, so definitely talk about that. I have some courses, but how else, should people begin this sort of process if they want to become sort of a true expert and really start to incorporate sort of the things that you and I have been able to do?
For sure. And I remembered my point, so I'm going to add that in
let's
there.
Add that in.
Which is just with nutrition studies, I think, we have a lot of epidemiology, a lot of retrospective stuff. It's very hard to have randomized controlled trials on specific populations. And then also we have to look at who is funding the research. And a lot of times there may be companies with certain biases that might be funding the research that we're looking at. So that's just for nutrition. Obviously with medicine, that's kind of another story. And then for training and exercise physiology, I think those studies are kind of unique in themselves. And we kind of have to look at these categorically. In terms of for advice, for Jade's question, as far as practitioners, I think people need to get comfortable, and you can do this at home or in your office or just with clients or maybe with another coach or with your peers. You need reps explaining the material. You just need to practice, and sort of the information is malleable and you can deliver it in really any way, but you have to find your style. It's kind of like, it's almost like hip hop in a way, or any type of music or an artist. Some of it just requires practice and reps and getting the feel for how you want to teach things. And I think every time I have to teach, or every time I have to prepare something, every time I talk about something, I get just a little bit better at talking about it. But if you never talk about it, if you never try to use anecdote or analogy, you're not going to progress at being a great storyteller or using analogy, right? So I think the first step is think about your own story, your own fitness transformation, and leverage that story to talk about how this information actually applies. Make it real, and so people can connect. I think you have to start with stories there. And then I would just say getting reps in terms of teaching can be very important. And really anyone who will listen or just practice sort of by yourself, write it. I think writing is very, very helpful. Not enough people actually write about this material. They're only they read it in a textbook, think about it, pass the test, and then they take on clients. But I think things like writing articles or trying to outline your thoughts can really help propel you forward in terms of even just your ability to execute with clients on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I love those. I love those, and I'll add a few more here. One thing is you can practice lateral thinking, and this is something something that you can do, sort of wherever. So a typical example of lateral thinking would be if you're having your coffee in the morning, well, obviously that cup that you're drinking out of can hold coffee. It can hold liquid. That's one thing. But it also can be many other things that you probably haven't thought about. So it could be a pencil holder. If you empty out the coffee and put pencils in there, you could turn it upside down and make it a drum. You can, when we were kids, we used to take those paper cups and cut holes in them, and they acted as phones. There's you can make them storage things. There's many different things you can do with a cup besides drinking liquid out of it, and that helps get your brain thinking differently. It's like funny. There's a funny story about the guy who came up with the Dyson vacuum cleaner. One of the things he did is he worked in the, I think, in the sawmill industry, and one of the things that he saw in the sawmill industry is that they use these big turbines that would basically pull all this stuff in and then blow out all the dust to the side and where it'd fall down. And he saw that from one area of expertise that had nothing to do with vacuums, and decided to bring that technology into the vacuum space. That's an example of lateral thinking, and you can do that with everything completely unrelated to metabolism and get very good at it. The other thing that I did that was really weird when I was in biochemistry, in undergrad and in medical school, is I just got into the habit of doing sort of a Socratic style of learning where I would say, well, insulin does this. Why? And well, because of this. Why? Because of this. Well, how does that work? And I would go 5, 6 whys deep to really understand. And one of the key points I got to is this whole thing of insulin resistance. I was like, well, asking questions like, well, is insulin resistance always the same? Is it the same in the liver? Is it the same in the fat cell? Does muscle experience insulin resistant the same way? Can the brain become insulin resistant? And what you find when you start going down deep into these holes is you find like, no, it's not a full body thing. The liver can have insulin resistance while other tissues may not. The brain responds differently. So once you start really asking these deep questions, you start to get very, very good at this stuff. So that's the other, my second point. And my last point would be, goes into something that you said, Sam. To me, it is about reps. I have this saying that I always like to use. This is in life, it's in career, it's in the gym. Easy is earned. And one of the things that Sam said is just reps, reps, reps. That's an example of easy is earned. And so to me, part of easy is earned is also sort of an Adlerian psychology statement of the courage to be disliked. And so for me, if you really want to learn this stuff, you blog, you podcast, you post on it. We're in an era now where you can literally get direct feedback. So if I put something out and a troll or someone has something to say about it, it's a great opportunity for me to go, oh, how can I think laterally about that? Or how can I ask why deeper and really understand or explain it better so that I'm not open to that? So I used to get that stuff all the time. Now I get it very little. And part of it is because I think, I'm more well-known now, but I also think I just explain things a little bit better. So those would be all the ways that I would say to sort of look at this. So any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I really like that easy is earned, and always remember that, you can start with the most basic concept. So maybe you just teach what a protein is. You don't have to start with teaching someone about insulin resistance. I think it would be much more simple to start with where you have the most education and foundation and then branch out. Guess what? As you get better at teaching about protein or calories, or as you get better teaching about exercise, as you learn topics, it will, you'll progress with your ability to showcase more difficult information. I think people try to start with just the fancy stuff because it sounds cool, but getting really good at explaining the basics still has a lot of power to it, because your audience out there may be folks who need to cultivate an understanding of the basics. And I think this was in The Obstacle is the Way. It's like Elysium is a myth. Behind mountains, it's a Haitian proverb. Behind mountains, there's always more mountains. So as you get better at explaining things and teaching things, Jade and I have kind of progressed. It's like, sure, we might be able to teach about metabolism, but then finding a model or a framework for something else, it still becomes progressively more difficult as you try to tackle larger concepts to really have an impact.
Yeah, I love it, man, and love this discussion. Thanks for hanging out, and let's go hit the gym, brother.
There we go.